I would like to call to order the April 10th, 2012 meeting of the Historic Preservation Commission. I'd like to let you know that this meeting is being recorded. I'd also like to call to your attention that we have equipment available for anyone who is hearing impaired. Please let us know if you need assistance in that manner. Fiona, could you call the roll, please?
Rod Burton.
Here.
Sarah Campbell. Kurt Carpenter. David Christensen. Marilyn Master.
Here.
Jean Milius.
Here.
Jim Talbot. Sean Welbeck. And George Volker. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to introduce the staff people that are present. Kurt Nabafeld, Senior Planner. Katie Franks, Development Specialist. Jackie Lynch, Planner 2. Is Kate Newell in? Oh, there she is, Kate Newell, GIS Analyst. And Fiona Starr, Recording Secretary. The authority of the Historic Preservation Committee to hold public meetings is set forth in Title 17.90 of the Bellingham Municipal Code. We do have some minutes that we would like to approve. If those are the minutes from the meeting of April 3rd, and we were sent copies of these in our packet. Does anybody have any things of note to say about these minutes?
I move we approve.
Pardon?
I move we approve.
Okay. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. We approve the minutes from April 3rd. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstained? Okay, motion carries. We're having a meeting today to go over, to have an update from of the Downtown Historic Resource Survey and Inventory Project.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Hi.
No,
Oh, could you just acknowledge that as part of the minutes, that the letter from
oh,
last
okay,
time?
I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, as part
Just
of
let
the
people know
minutes,
you'll
there
sign
was the letter of the summary of what we had decided at the meeting on April 3rd, which you also received in your packets. Does anybody have any comments on that? Okay, hearing none, and I assume we're good to go, and I have signed, will sign, and have signed that letter. So, okay, back to the Downtown Historic Resource Survey and Inventory Project. So we will start out with a report from Katie, I assume.
I don't know if we want to hit some of the lights down. We've got a couple of presentations. So I'm Katie Franks, Development Specialist with Planning and Community Development. And we're going to talk today, give you an overview, an introduction to the Downtown City Center, Central Business District Historic Resource Survey for Bellingham. This project was initiated as part of a downtown planning process that I'm going to tell you about. It's an update of the City Center Master Plan that was initiated almost 11, 12 years ago. So this is a really great opportunity for us to do this. The scope is we looked at the downtown neighborhood, the CBD neighborhood, Central Business District, and then also reached out to a little bit more of the downtown planning area, and we tried to grab as many properties in other neighborhoods that hadn't been surveyed already. So that's, the brown is the properties that were surveyed as part of this project. Everything that was built before 1962 was surveyed, because generally speaking, historic means 50 years old. All property types were surveyed. So there's commercial, industrial, residential, there's mixed use, civic, the full gamut being researched. The city community development is sponsoring this project, and we funded it through a grant from the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. We got $10,000. We asked for more. We'd hoped to do a little bit more, but this is what we got, and it's basically it's a year-long project. It started in October, and it'll finish in August. We were really lucky to get to hire Artifacts Consulting from Tacoma. These are the people that worked on the project or are working on the project. We've got Michael Sullivan here today and Spencer Howard. And then Katie Chase and Susan Johnson both worked on the project as well. They're not here today. A little bit more about them in a minute. Have to give a little shout out to the volunteers. Jim Talbot, our Preservation Commissioner, and Gail Helgo, Assistant Director to the Library, Emeritus. Ruth Bakke, Special Librarian, Emeritus, and then Colby Labrie. I don't know if she's here today. The four of these volunteers, they have been working with the city on a number of preservation projects. They've donated hours and hours and hours of time, and we could not do this project without them. So we thank them again and again, and we're sorry that your mind is numb now. The people at the bottom, Jeff Jewell, Ruth Steele, and then Sarah Campbell, who's a commissioner as well, they've all contributed time. Their job is preservation, but they have donated above and beyond their workload. Sarah Campbell, in particular, back in the early 2000s, she had her class work with us downtown doing extensive survey of commercial buildings for the multiple property listing. And that information was really valuable for this project. So we thank them as well. So the reason we're doing this, just to let people know, you probably know about City Council's legacy statements. And number 4 is to preserve sense of place. City Council determined that it was really important for the city to preserve sense of place by supporting neighborhoods and encouraging development within the existing infrastructure, not to sprawl, and then specifically to preserve historic and cultural resources. So this project addresses that legacy directly. Another goal is to identify buildings and districts that are eligible for listing in the national, the state, or the local register. And this historic photo of Bay Street, Bay Holly Prospect. Back 10 years ago, this area wasn't eligible for national district status. But now, due to all the rehab that's gone on down in that area, the restoration of buildings, the public involvement, we spoke with the state historian, and he said he thinks there's probably a district down here now, and he was very impressed with the way downtown had grown. Just a little aside, this feeds into the downtown planning process. Some of you may have seen Darby Galligan and Tara Sundin down at the farmers market getting input about what people like about downtown. Back in 2000, so like I said, about 12 years ago, Nori Winter came here and worked extensively with the public to develop a downtown master plan. Since that time, a lot of the suggestions have been implemented from that master plan. So Darby and Tara have taken it upon themselves to update and to repeal that former downtown master plan and create a new one. And they've done a public outreach process, like I said, at the farmers market, and then also using social media via the city website and Facebook. And they're done with the phase 1, which is getting all the input. They've created a really beautiful survey report, which is online at the city. And then also next week, next Wednesday, there's a presentation at Blue Horse. Just wanted to let you all know about that. 5 to 6, you get to see what some of the survey results were. Oops. And then something I wanted to point out, because looking at the survey, the strongest agreement from all the people that were surveyed for this downtown process were that historic buildings add to the character of downtown. So it's really come full circle, I think in my tenure here over 12 years, for where people had not really looked at downtown, and now they're looking at it in a whole different way, and a lot of that's because of the stewardship of people who've invested in buildings, who've moved down there, and then people like you who take the time to care and to educate each other about the importance of these buildings. So another project that's coming along, I don't know if we have any property owners in the audience, but one thing that we're trying to do as part of the downtown planning process is to really help address barriers to rehabilitation of historic buildings. Because a lot of times you come to the permit center and it's like, whoa, it's an old building, you're going to have to do this, 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 and this. We want to help facilitate the rehabilitation of historic buildings. So we'll be talking with property owners, talking with Jim Tinner, the inspector, the building inspector for Bellingham, and then also doing some outreach education and some technical training for people to help them understand where there might be some financial benefits or some code leniency. So that's all going to be part of this bigger planning project over the next year. So back to the National, State, and Local Historic Registers. I think everybody in this audience knows what those are, but just want to give a primer. Basically, the first two, the national and state, they're honorary, and they provide no protections. The Bellingham Register, that's the local register, it's the most protective. This project, it's only information. We're just putting it out there, and if people want to nominate their buildings, then that will be, they can come to us and we might be able to facilitate that, but there's no pressure for anyone to list their buildings or to designate a district at this point. Previous surveys, the brown areas are those areas that the city...
Excuse me, Katie.
Yeah?
Would you mind going back a slide and talking a little bit about the incentives and benefits of registering your building?
Okay. Yeah, so for the National Register, the National Park Service oversees that, and a lot of times there are grants available. If you are listed on the National Register or you're in a district, it gives you a leg up for grant eligibility. Also, there have been studies that have shown that property increases tend to rise in historic districts because those are sought-after areas. And then there are also tax incentives, both at the federal level and the local level. Same thing goes with the state historic register. It's a little bit less status than the national. But then at the Bellingham, the local register level, the incentives are special valuation, which is a special tax valuation where if you put 25% of your assessed building value, that's minus the land, over a 2-year period, then you can recoup that over a 10-year period via your property taxes. So that's a financial incentive. And then adaptive use permits as well. That is something, say you have a historic building like the firehouse down here in the bottom. The Fairhaven Firehouse, when the city sold that, surplused it back in 2002, it would have, the zoning would have automatically gone back to public, and you wouldn't have been able to have a performance center. You wouldn't have been able to have any kind of business there. It's single family. But through the adaptive use permit, which is more lenient for historic buildings, they were able to put all those uses in and keep that building viable over time. Previous surveys. So the city, now there have been a lot of surveys done in the past. In fact, Michael was he initiated one back in '85, the 80s and '85. But some of the ones that have been sponsored by the city in the last 5 years and have actually been entered into the state database and our city's GIS database, which means they're accessible to all of you. These neighborhoods have been surveyed, and they've resulted in 4 new National Historic Districts over the last 3-4 years. So we now have 7, I think, 7 historic districts, and then 1 multiple property listing in downtown, which is, that was, instead of having a historic district, we were able to do a thematic nomination for commercial buildings built before 1919. Some of the outcomes of this project are information. Getting this historical research, again, thanks to the volunteer, getting some really enriched research, culling photographs, historic photographs, and then the consultants document the existing condition, so it's a snapshot in time, and all this is loaded into the state database. It's called Wizard, and also City IQ, online access for the public. And then there'll also be a survey report, which will be released at the end of the summer, which will have recommendations and a wealth of information that's been supplied by the consultants. Some other outcomes are illustration capability. We're really lucky to have Kate Newell and Chris Behe, but Kate Newell works mostly on the historic, and she's not only skilled with data, but she's an artist. And she creates amazing graphics for people that are really compelling, I think, when trying to express a neighborhood character or type of building that's occurring or an age. So this information can get uploaded directly into GIS, and we can use it for planning. Again, the incentives, this gives people a leg up if they are interested in listing their building or just finding out more about it. And then economic development. If you look at Fairhaven, back in '77, there was a historic district formed in that area, and since then, that area has really flourished. So it can really be a revitalization tool. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael Sullivan. He's going to give you an update on the progress that Michael and he and Spencer and Katie and Susan have made. And just want to reiterate again how lucky we are to have Michael and his team. Michael's been practicing preservation in the Pacific Northwest for over 20 years. He has a master's degree from Western, and he was, I think, the first Whatcom County preservation officer back in the 80s and conducted the first county-wide historic resource survey, as well as the historic neighborhood survey back in the 80s, which a lot of people still refer to. He's written nominations for numerous National Register buildings, and he also completed an architectural resource overview back in the mid-'80s for Bellingham's downtown once the mall came in, and people really wanted to keep downtown alive. So we're really lucky that Michael, he's kept a really big place in his heart for Bellingham, and aside from paid work, he comes up, he does all kinds of pro bono work for us, so we're just really lucky to have him. And now I'm going to stop gushing and turn it over to Michael.
Gosh, thanks, Katie. You know what? At their best, cities tell an authentic narrative about themselves, and I think we're lucky that Bellingham does a much better job than most cities. It's a truism that when you get back before about 1940, in our part of the world anyway, cities are largely handmade, and they're handmade out of largely local materials. And really what we've kind of gotten an eye for, I think one thing that Artifacts and our team really do a good job at is just recognizing and admiring craftsmanship and materials and just the ability to make a city, to make a building, and to have that still be there, to have it still have integrity. So that's really what I'm going to talk about. We're really right in the middle of the survey part of this project, the inventory part of it. And Spencer Howard with our firm, who's kind of our technical guy, has really kind of taken over the project now. What I was going to talk about today was just a little bit about that narrative, to look a little bit at what we've found so far, a little bit about the story that Bellingham tells. And a little bit about the patterns that are there and that are evident in the city. And you know, I played with the idea of calling them ghosts, that somehow if you look at a city that there's part of its narrative is sort of ethereal and transparent, or kind of drifts in and out in kind of a gauzy way. And that isn't really true in Bellingham. I mean, I think the patterns of the city's development are still evident. They still make up a part of the fabric of the city that we're around and are passed through and are in every day. It's just that they've been diluted a little bit by the multiple layers as they've been laid down. And so what I hope I can do is just kind of separate those layers a little bit and talk a little bit about the method and sort of the way we've kind of deconstructed the built city, the physical remnants of the city, and what we've been looking at in the sort of way that we've just kind of looked at the city. One thing I think, and I told myself, I wrote this down, you know, avoid a rant on the automobile. So I'm going to avoid that, but I know I'm going to slip into it. But one reality is that the automobile, its convenience, its demands on a city and on a built environment has a very caustic effect on what's handmade of a city that did not, a city that was built not anticipating that automobile, that convenience, that contraption, and what it needed in order to function. So, and Bellingham is a classic example of that, in that we're a seaport city, first of all, and it's too bad unless you're a sailor and you go out on Wednesday nights and sail. I think we don't think every day about ourselves as a seaport, and yet the first people that came here, Native American people that came here, came by boat. The ethnic culture here were canoe people. They came and went by water. The first Europeans to come here came by water. The first industry we developed, the first residences we built, everything had to do with proximity to salt water and to fresh water that came down through Whatcom Creek. And we don't think that we built our city consciously thinking about people seeing it for the first time upon arrival by water. So oftentimes, buildings that were built in the seaport days now, 1890s, that era, we oftentimes, those facades we've allowed to be turned to the alley, to the back, instead of recognizing that they're actually, that was the front of our buildings. And we've just, it's something we're thinking about, is just consciously thinking about when the builders put the buildings up, what were they thinking about? And one of them was that the front was to the west. The other big factor in the downtown, and something that very much goes on in the downtown today, and we kind of stumble across it and we use it, but we don't think about it, and that is the railroad, and how important the railroad was to the city plan, to the spatial arrangement of buildings, and to the type of materials and the way we built buildings because of the coming of the railroad. This was the railroad station, which was down about where the farmers market is today. The far west end of the building is right about where the beginning of the lot where the farmers market is. And the double siding width that ran through on Railroad Avenue was the widest boulevard and the largest open space in the downtown from the very beginning, and it continues to be that today. We've sort of turned it into a parking lot in a way, but in terms of spatial relief in the downtown, railroad is very much it. The other thing was the railroad, although this building looks like it's all wood, the railroad brought a real consciousness to fireproofness. They really, really wanted buildings not to burn down. And it wasn't just because of cinders and clinkers coming off the steam locomotives. It was that if you were going to build right adjacent to their railroad tracks and to their business. They didn't want a conflagration wiping out what they were doing. In 1889, the year that we achieved statehood, downtown Seattle, Spokane, Yakima all had major fires and lost their downtowns, their wooden downtowns, all in 1 year. And after 1889, the railroad didn't allow anything but brick to be built. That's why the buildings along railroad, although a lot of them are kind of plain today and low rise, they're, for the most part, very sturdily built buildings, and they're largely built out of non-combustible materials with very high clearances, very higher ceilings than elsewhere in the downtown. And that's all pretty well demanded by the railroad that pretty well could dictate who was going to be able to build along their sidings. This is 1942 when we finally tore the downtown train station down. By this time, F. Stanley Piper's beautiful little station down in Old Town was finished. So the main passenger depot had moved down closer to the waterfront. And so this was the way the building looked as they finally took it down. And this just gives you a real good feel for just the space. This is looking east on Railroad, and you really get a feel for the quality of it in the downtown. It was all paved in red brick. Much of that red brick is still underground in sections down on Railroad Avenue, and something to think about in the future. I won't go. I threw a few slides in here just to tell stories, but I know I'm going to take too long, so I won't stop the story. But the first transcontinental railroad to arrive down on Railroad in 1888, I believe. This is hysterical. The Seaholm and the Whatcom fire departments both came out with their brass buttons and their big chrome helmets and everything, and the train was full of the railroad officials and governors and hotshots in their cutaway coats and their top hats and everything. It was a summer day. And the big idea was that they were going to create an archway with the hoses on each side. And so the train pulled in. The Whatcom guys, the pumpers had been imbibing on something other than water that day. And so they were slow to get the pump going. And the water pressure came up at a slow pace. As it came up, the train pulled in and the hoses went right in the windows and just kind of doused everybody. And then when they finally got over the top, they went over the top on the fire team on the other side, who are now infuriated because their fancy uniforms are soaking wet. And so by the time the train passed all the way through, the two sides just leveled their hoses at each other, and this huge water fight broke out downtown on Railroad. So anyway, just what a crack up. Anyway, Railroad we should keep just for the comic theater value of it, you know. So anyway, here's early on. Of course, we had quickly, once the automobile arrives, and the train stop, we sort of gave up on the access for rail service. Spencer was reminding me when they were walking around looking that when you get down to the east side of Railroad where the old railroad tracks divide, we still have those railroad tracks in the ground that run kind of behind the buildings off State Street that kind of angle off before they cross Whatcom Creek. So there's some great kind of artifacts of that, and that's the one place in the city plan downtown where we don't have a strict grid, where the natural curve that's defined by the radius of the railroad begins to shape that. And it's kind of a sweet little bend there where the curve of the railroad meets the natural path of Whatcom Creek, and it kind of creates something other than just a strict 45-degree grid. nice little area down there, and it's kind of lost. It's kind of too bad. That's a really nice section down there, and there's a lot of parking and bank drive-throughs and stuff. But it's something to think about, because historically that was an area where the railroad provided service down there, and there was warehouses and light manufacturing and stuff, and some pretty good building stock down there. Unglamorous but very reusable type buildings. Also was noticing, I forget if I was talking to Katie or somebody about just the way we use the parking space. Here you can see the configuration in the 1950s was obviously different than the way we park people on railroad, and that was because they kept the tracks down the middle, and they had a nice wide stretch that ran down between all the cars. I don't know if you ever ride a bike down railroad going down to the bakery or not, but it's really a scary place to ride a bike, and that's too bad, because it's really a place. Bagel tastes good when you're on a bike ride. So anyway, it would be nice. I mean, maybe we think about, I don't know, Mark Twain had a comment that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And maybe we need a rhyme down there of some kind that recalls the railroad in some way, and maybe also creates, all over the country, old retired railroads have become trails, rails to trails programs, and maybe we need to think about people that aren't just in automobiles. I don't know. Wait and see. Here's the, you can't see this picture very well, but you can see the fine brickwork between the rails. I really like the way down in Fairhaven there where Harris crosses 11th, and they did some new asphalting, and they kept the brick memory of the old streetcar line that ran up. Jackie, you probably had a hand in that, but anyway, just keeping that smooth little change in the paving down there is really a nice touch in that historic district. So I don't know. Interesting to know what's still under down there. Anyway, backing on the railroad tracks was Leopold Hotel, of course, and this is one of those buildings, you know, when the 1950s came, buildings like that were quick to go. So one thing the railroad did was they wanted brick fireproof buildings, and the Leopold was maybe the largest of the fireproof structures that came because of the railroad. And of course now the tower is still there, but the old Leopold is not anymore. Some of the other buildings along there that are just, you know, they're sturdy, industrial. This is a good example of just really versatile buildings for a modern use. We tend to be a little jazzier about the way that we use buildings like this, so they look a little spruced up and stuff, but you know, they're still, they don't need glamour, and they kind of absorb this kind of liveliness very easily, and you know, 10 years from now it might be something different, and yet the building, kind of like the Montgomery sign with the date up above, you know, somehow seem to survive these things. It's a real sign of health in cities, I think, to watch sturdy 1-, 2-story industrial buildings that were built with a 100-year expectation in mind, to watch the way they turn over and the way they make their way through a much longer time frame, as opposed to new buildings today that we tend to assemble out of pre-manufactured parts that all come with a guarantee of 10 years or so, you know. Yet the handmade buildings tend to last a lot longer. Anyway, the public market downtown, too, the first public market, of course, was located where it was because of the railroad, too. The intersection of the railroad and the streetcars, this building, of course, is still there today. And I don't think it's quite as glamorous today as it was, but still under there, you know, are the bones, the shadow of, you know, of a pretty busy place. It's sort of interesting how I don't know, when I was in school, in graduate school here, I can't remember all the uses it's gone through, but it seems like this building is almost cycling back. Rite Aid is kind of close to the way it was, that sort of public market kind of thing and all the stuff you can get there. Anyway, so I threw these two slides in. Jeff Jewell gave them to me today just because I wanted to throw something in about the fact that at the bottom of Holly, it used to be that for people that weren't coming in by the railroad, they were arriving by water, and some people arriving by rail were transferring to water and vice versa. People were transferring from water to rail, which is why they eventually moved the passenger service down closer to the waterfront. But I don't know if you can sense the vitality here in Citizen Dock in its heyday. This probably about the time of the First World War. And then here it was, in the years before it was finally demolished. And I remember going through this building with its beautiful big timbers that spanned all the way across. So I know it made it into the 80s anyway, but too bad. Whatcom Waterway was the first waterway on the West Coast that the Army Corps of Engineers began to build exactly to the dimensions of the Panama Canal, specifically anticipating that bigger ships would be able to start not having to go all the way around the tip of South America, would be able to come through the Panama Canal. And Bellingham was the first city to actually build with that in mind. So the dimensions, that squareness of Whatcom Waterway and the orientation to the prevailing wind is all determined back then, very much linked to the history of the Panama Canal in those years before the First World War. So I guess depending on what happens down there, we'll see whether remnants of the old Whatcom Waterway survive or not. We'll see. I want to talk a little bit about, of course, even in the days of railroad and stuff, that people did get around in streetcars. Bellingham had a very elaborate streetcar system, and what happened, the neighborhoods would develop, and the way you got to the neighborhood before and even after the automobile appeared was through a streetcar system that tended to nexus and hub downtown, so it brought people into the downtown on a variety of different arterials, different streetcar routes, and a lot of buildings developed throughout the city exclusively because of the streetcar system. So if you look carefully, if you squint your eyes a little bit, you get into a neighborhood and all of a sudden there's a house on a corner that the front of the building comes right up to the sidewalk, you can pretty well guess that that was a streetcar stop. In the downtown, the prominent streetcar buildings are easy to spot, and a lot of them survive today. They've been modified and they've kind of gone through whatever happens to them, but this is just a little montage of some of the buildings that lined the street prior to the streetcar. I love this shot on Commercial. A lot of these photos that I'm going to come to in a minute also help us to remember that before there was a city here, there was a steep cliffside, there was a hillside that dropped down to the mud flats, and we've filled a lot of that in. But that steep kind of edge of the uplands, which I'm trying to remember her name now. Anyway, I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, it's really beautifully described in a novel that I read, and I'm completely drawing a blank on it right now. Annie Dillard's book, Living. She describes that cliff kind of thing when you get to the water. Well, this is one of the best shots I saw. This is on Commercial, and of course this sort of celebrates the arrival of the automobile. But it's interesting to realize that the building's still there. It's still with us and still has a practical use. It's just that, and look at the way that it used to just drop off and you could kind of see the view in the background right off the end of Commercial Street. We were noticing, in fact, Spencer and folks were noticing that when you get into the alleys and you're walking down on Bay and Commercial and even down on Cornwall, how quickly that edge right there, that knoll, begins to introduce you to a view out over the water. That's that part. If you're walking around in the downtown, it's kind of right there where you really, it dawns on you you're in a seaport city, because you really do get a really nice view from there. So you're walking down the alley and it's got a better view than most boulevards. So anyway, we like alleys. So also down on Lower Holly, just that quality of railroad era buildings. I was talking to Katie today about this distinction between, in architecture and the technology of building buildings, that before 1900 buildings, largely unreinforced masonry, are limited to 3, 4, 5 stories. They're brick buildings. After 1900, we start to have reinforced steel, reinforced concrete, steel frame, and the technology of buildings changes a lot. Holly Street predates that, so the norm along Holly tends to follow that unreinforced masonry pattern, and yet, you know, we still very much use the buildings today. They're still with us and really in great shape. So I didn't include a photo of the hardware building just because those bay windows are a little, I don't know, it didn't work for me, but anyway. Also, Cornwall was a major streetcar line heading out of the city too, and this is just I noticed Katie used this shot too, a really beautiful photograph, and this block is pretty well intact. It's still, the buildings along here are all still with us, and you know, they haven't been dramatically modified at all. They're really, with the exception of those stretch awnings that someday code officials will begin to disfavor them, but anyway, but anyhow, they serve a practical purpose. It's ironic, buildings from this era typically had high ground floors, they had a storefront level, and then they had a transom level up above that provided natural light into the retail space on the ground floor, and that upper transom area, storefronts, typically had operable windows, sometimes hoppers, some kind of operable window. So it allowed them, and then they would have a retractable canvas awning. And it, as a passive energy system, especially for buildings like this that are facing south, it allowed you to manage cooling and heating during the year. When you seal up a front like this, you drop the ceiling on the inside and then you put in an awning like this. It forces you to pretty well rely on mechanical heating and cooling on the inside. So someday what will happen is those inefficient heat pumps and cooling systems will be replaced by microsystems that can manage the lower range of heating and cooling you need when they're only there to assist passive systems that are using the natural systems that are in place, which, by the way, the buildings as technology objects are designed to take advantage of, and we somehow kind of shut those off, and then we do this. So this is that edge I was talking about, that where the backs of all these buildings we've really done a disservice to, because the backs of these buildings have just spectacular advantageous view out over the waterway. And in the future, when the GP site and all that does get developed, this is going to be pretty premium property along here, and these buildings I think are going to be appreciated much more than they are today. But anyway, you get a feel for how these buildings along there were all really, really well built to begin with. Because they were in an important location in the city. And over time, the pattern of the city has just changed, and they went through a phase of being kind of unimportant. And now I think with the expansion of the museum and the Renaissance stuff, that I think we'll probably discover these buildings along here actually have some real potential for reuse. I doubt if we're going to be able to come up with, if these buildings were to go away, if we were able to come up with replacement buildings that had the same scale and the same quality of materials. So they're buildings that just would, just are great candidates for reuse. See how much more important that street was. You did a parade down that street, Just another example, Salvation Army building. Still with us, still a handsome building. Beautiful proportions on this building. For a small 2-story, 2.5-story building, this is it ideally sized building for its location, and yet the back side of this building is just completely kind of ignored. If you drive by and look at the back of it, it's really too bad they don't pay more attention to the potential of it. And then the old theater building across the street, which is just so precisely like it was, with the exception of windows, that I had to throw it in. So another thing we really are excited about downtown is the Metropolitan Tract. Bellingham got a really big jolt in the 1920s. The Metropolitan Company did a series of developments on University of Washington property in downtown Seattle. They built the Fifth Avenue Theater and Olympic Hotel, those buildings in the downtown, the Joshua Green building. And then they turned their attention to Bellingham and bought up a big chunk of the downtown. And in a burst of investment, made some major additions to the downtown in the early age of the automobile. And really, when we look at the way the city absorbed the effect, the way the streetcars are kind of pushed out of the way and the automobile takes over, Highway 99 gets rerouted right through the core of the downtown, and the city begins to kind of absorb the shock of the coming of the automobile. Although Bellingham held on to its streetcars longer than anybody else in our state. They didn't get rid of streetcars until late 1938, almost 1939, so really a long time we still had streetcars. But the advent of the concession to the automobile really came with the building of the properties in the Metropolitan Tract. And they included, most notably, the Mount Baker Theater and the Bellingham Hotel. They also included the Montague building that became the Bon Marché. They did a renovation on the little triangle building on Magnolia, and played a role actually in building the Bellingham Herald building as well. But the big investment was in the hotel and the theater, the Mount Baker. There's actually a tunnel under the street that runs between the Bellingham Towers, it's called today, owned by the Hollanders, and now it's all offices and retail. But of course, originally it was, the Grand Hotel that kind of led to the decline of the Leopold in the downtown, and great Art Deco, early Deco building. Anyway, in terms of skyscrapers in modern times, that was the beginning of all that. Oh, and I just threw this in because we've been talking about the idea of the importance historically of that group of buildings right down in the core. The Triangle building is actually really early, 1906 or 7, reinforced concrete building, but using building technology that was repeated in the Bellingham Tower and in the Mount Baker Theater. And although it predates those buildings by quite a bit, it certainly fits in. Strikes me how modern this building looks for a building that's over a century old. And of course, it's lost its cornice around the top and some features, but just really great building, and kind of belongs in that group. There's a pretty dense group, very highly urban, higher scale buildings that are all clustered around in this general area that I think when Michael Hauser was here, I know it caught his eye, it caught mine too, that it might be time for us to think about a historic district in the downtown that might be centered around this group downtown. And then finally, just when the automobile did finally come through, I stole this from the slideshow that Katie put together on Highway 99 going through the downtown. But it was the highway really that really did redirect the sort of rhythm of the streets as far as Bellingham went. In the earliest days, the highway came through Fairhaven, out along the bay, downstate, then turned on Holly, went down, went out Eldridge, and went out and followed the shoreline pretty much. By the time Highway 99 got done, it came overland, kind of followed by Lake Samish, by Lake Padden there, the way you come in today, and then down to Holly Street, and then all the way down Holly, and then out. It jogged actually down on Sunset, and then started out northwest and eventually went over and went out Guide Meridian until the freeway got built. So that was the main, and that channeled most of the tourism traffic and increasingly bus traffic for people that were going up to Vancouver from Seattle. So we had all that traffic coming right through our downtown, and it really did start to change the way the downtown worked. It also pushed our retail, you know, Penny's and Sears and all those guys, off of Holly Street and pushed them off onto Cornwall and off away from the busy traffic that was that ran along Holly. And it led to the building of motels and hotels like the Travel Lodge on Railroad that were built right along the main highway to capture that traffic. And you can kind of see the cafes and the eating places that were meant to kind of snag hungry tourists as they were buzzing through town. So I threw this in just because I bemoan the loss of the dormers on this nice little fine arts building on Holly. Too bad, but it's still with us. A charming little great building. And these are just a few little views of along Holly Street of buildings that survived and the modification they went through as the highway started to change the downtown. This was recently renovated, so sort of what's happened there. And I think that might be kind of the end. The last was this building and how we sometimes get a little snobby about you know, design tastes and stuff, and I was thinking to myself, here's a building that dates from the 1890s, unreinforced, a building from the age of the railroad. So from this corner down there, it has watched the whole parade go by from the very beginning all the way up to today. And this photo, probably taken in the early 1960s somewhere, kind of has huge, big, garish signage on the outside, but somehow you kind of still make out the railroad era behind it. And of course, here it is today. Still kind of going through the good and the bad, sort of, but sort of our witness on Holly Street. Anyway, that's kind of what I was going to cover, Katie, in terms of talking about what we're looking for, what we're looking at in the downtown. We're compelled by the narrative. You know, we understand the history of the city and the story it tells, and now it's just kind of like detectives going out and trying to find the evidence and putting together the case. And I think we're well on our way. It's great to be working downtown, and it's great to see that story is still intact from our perspective. So anyway, thank you very much.
Can we ask some questions? So does anybody on the commission want to ask a question of Michael or Katie? No? Does anybody in the audience want to ask a question or make a statement? I'd like you to limit your comments to 5 minutes if you do want to say something. Okay, can you come to a microphone and state your name and your address? And
Lynette Felber, 507 14th Street. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the work you've done and how interesting it is. And I was particularly, this is just a question, I was curious about your comments about a potential metropolitan district and wondered if it's too early to elaborate a bit on that. Is that the Metropolitan Life Insurance that was doing this investment? And if also, if this were a district, what kind of dates would you give it for a period of significance?
Well, the Metropolitan Development Company was a group of investors who bought real estate and developed it, and kind of were riding the high tide of the 1920s. And so, no, it's just a common story for a few of the buildings that are down there. But it might be something to organize a larger historic district around, because there are certainly some very strong buildings kind of in that cluster. The federal building is down there. So that might be something to build on as just kind of a really rock solid core, and then it might get a little more fragmented as we work out from there. And I think you know, that's kind of a big leap. You get an inventory done, and then you begin to look at what are the strong groups that may potentially meet the criteria for listing on the national register or a local register. And so this is very preliminary. We're just starting to look at that. But you know, for a city this size, there's the kind of densities where historic districts make sense. Certainly stronger than, like, you know, Everett or Vancouver or Yakima, you know, Eugene. I mean, it's just a much more coherent. I think because the group of buildings in the Metropolitan Tract all happen at exactly the same time, they're like siblings. So it's a real solid chapter to be able to begin to work around and think about. Several of the buildings are already on the National Register too. So anyway, a lot of thinking. It's good. Not to get off on this too much, but it's good timing in that the city is doing a comprehensive plan right now. And there are a lot of things in the comprehensive plan that can encourage adaptive reuse and the conservation of buildings. And when you can use a cultural value to kind of reinforce those kinds of principles that go into a comprehensive plan, makes the comprehensive plan better, and it makes your preservation program stronger. So.
Come on down and ask.
Yes, my name's Ann Mackey, and I live in one of the National Historic Districts, the York neighborhood, 1351 Humboldt. And my question is related to the potential for the economic rebirth of downtown if it's coupled with establishment of a historic downtown district, and as you said, adaptive reuse of historic buildings for new commercial uses with living space above. So if you could just maybe speak to the issue of the economic benefits of downtown historic districts in terms of tourism or revitalizing the downtown businesses, even to attract our own community down into the downtown for shopping, and also maybe speak to the issue of the economic benefits of the rehabilitation and putting people to work in that rehabilitation effort.
Well, there's a bunch of things to say about that, but the best thing about rebuilding and renovating handmade buildings are that if you were to take $1 million to build a new building or $1 million to renovate an old building, the majority of the money spent on the new building would be in acquiring prefabricated materials that were produced somewhere else, and that money would all pretty much leave the community. when you renovate an old building, most of the cost goes into labor, which is traditional building skills, plumbers and carpenters and so on. And also the materials you buy, because the buildings are largely constructed out of indigenous materials. There's a much higher chance that the materials are going to be bought in smaller lots locally as well. So the capture, economic capture in a renovation of $1 million renovation versus a new building, the local capture is significantly higher with historic buildings. Also, I mean, downtowns have established senses of place that they've built up over a century or more, and that just can't be reproduced. You can't go out to a suburb somewhere and create a authentic downtown, you know. It's a great, not to digress, but there's a great story about a guy from Texas who goes to Hampton Court in England, and he's building a big mansion and a lawn, and he admires the lawn, and he goes up to the gardener and goes, I'm building this big spread outside of Houston, and I want a big lawn like that to look like that. How do I get a lawn like that? And the gardener says, well, you plant good English grass, and then you mow it regularly for 400 years. That's kind of that's how you get a downtown like this. You wait, you build to last, and then you maintain it over time, and it holds together. So there is that, the majority of the tax base in cities like Bellingham are tied up in the commercial core of the downtown. It's where property values are highest and the highest assessed value buildings are. So it makes sense that that's where you want to go back and make an investment with a return. Some of the things we've been talking about are just, there are disadvantages for older buildings because building codes have continued to have expectations of modern conveniences that older buildings, especially seismic and some of those things, it just takes a reinvestment, a significant reinvestment to get those buildings up to where they meet code. Cities with traditional older building stocks are increasingly getting smart about synchronizing their economic development efforts with their building fire codes so that they can still protect life safety, but also recognize that it may take a while for banks to have enough confidence to lend on commercial properties that are older. And a good example over in Ellensburg, where they've got a downtown that's largely two-story brick buildings. They've got a college there, and of course they've got demand for rental space downtown in second floors. But residential is, in terms of zoning, is the most difficult, the highest standard in terms of renovating a building. And in new construction, fire marshals want sprinklers in residential properties on second floors. What they're doing is beginning to look at saying, okay, if you're building a new building, yes, we want you to sprinkle that building. If you're renovating an older building and you have a small area, you have 2,500 or 5,000 square feet, we'll let you go ahead and have, a 5-year period to go ahead and make sure that you have exiting and hardwire alarms and everything. But, once you get occupancy and you have income produced by that space over a 5-year period, at the end of that 5 years, we want the space to be sprinkled. And if you don't have it sprinkled at the end of 5 years, we're going to revoke your certificate of occupancy. But it gives, and they do that with historic buildings because they recognize there's a public interest in those buildings being economically viable because that's the way they're going to stay with us. So, so there are things like that. There are, as Katie talked about, there is special valuation. There are property tax incentives for people to invest in historic properties. Just finally, not to go on too long about this, but just older buildings tend to be able to create quirkier but smaller retail and business spaces, whether they're artist studios or whatever. If you build a new building to modern code, the chances of that space being at a affordable rent for emerging artists or creatives within a community, it's very difficult to do. Older building, Jane Jacobs, you know, the great philosopher, said, you know, new ideas need old buildings, because you need that cheap, affordable, you know, fix it up yourself kind of space in a community. It's why cities attract creatives, and, you know, that's what keeps cities, you know, cities going. So anyway.
Any other comments or questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thanks everybody on your team, all the volunteers. That was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, Rod, let me also thank Gail and Jim and Colby and Ruth and everybody. I mean, this kind of an effort, you know, without the countless hours put in by the locals here, just, you know, isn't really within reach. So they've really been amazing. So thank you very much to them.
So do we have any announcements and reports?
I was just going to finalize with thanking Michael and Spencer for coming up and let you guys know that we'll be coming back to you with the results in late August or early September, and we'll be posting information online.
The National Preservation Commission Alliance meeting is in Norfolk, Virginia in July, and there's a brochure passing around. And the state of Washington has roughly $500 grants for Preservation Commission members that might be interested in going. I'm happy to provide you with the information or assist you in any way if you decide you do want to go. And there's just, I got online and got an idea of how much the ticket prices would be to fly there, red eye, and all that sort of stuff. So if you're interested in doing a red eye flight or anything else, just ask me. I'd be happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Any other announcements or reports? No? Okay, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for coming and watching this great presentation.